Well, thank you, everyone. I don't need to go and reintroduce myself, I suppose. But I come to you today here with a little different perspective on AI. And it's more of the position of, yes, there's risk, and we're going to talk about what that risk is, but more along the lines of us as security professionals and what this means for us and how a paradigm shift is here, where organizations that are going to be putting AI in, and they're going to, there's no question about it in my mind. We're in a scenario right now where Copilot specifically is just very familiar and relatable to so many people. So as opposed to security, governance, risk, and compliance and other functions within that ecosystem are not anymore able to just be put in the corner, we're now enabled to help the organization hit their business objectives, because there's going to be a split. Those organizations that enable AI and those that don't. And for those that do enable AI, there are going to be the organizations that do it safely and securely, and those that don't. So the things that I want to talk to you about today specifically are what has changed in 2024, and I kind of gave you a little bit of preview of that. And thanks to the MC here of giving that intro, I had to have these conversations all the time. Global Payments, so not the company, but a global payments company that was operating in the US, Singapore, UK, Switzerland. Oh, we used to be able to just say Europe before Brexit, for any of those that are familiar. But nonetheless, there was a lot of conversation that happened. And it was always, when we're talking about data risk of exfiltration, risk of unauthorized data access or disclosure, generally, the idea was that likelihood was acceptable because it was low to medium, right? It was something that it was going to take time, effort, and energy for any bad actor or insider to put in to make any of those things happen. So instead of focusing on data risk, and I would go so far as to argue everything that we do from a technology and a tool set today is focused on protecting our company's most critical assets, which is data. But now with AI, that likelihood of someone being able to do unauthorized data access or disclosure or data exfiltration is 100%. This isn't time, energy, and effort that's required. You do not need to be an advanced attacker. You don't need to have the whole, let's get in, do some reconnaissance, let's do some account enumeration, let's take over this account, now we're going to land and expand, and we're going to do all this stuff, and 8 months down the road, hey, we got you. This is going to happen right now. Because if I can ask a question to anybody here, and everybody here is able to hear me, and you communicate with each other, if you want to find something with some guardrails that are out there, you're going to uncover it. It's not time, effort, and energy. You don't need to be an expert. You need to be able to ask. So when it really comes down to it, what I do want to enforce today, and we're going to show what this looks like in the right way and what it's intended to be, and also what the unintentional consequences are as well. But ultimately, when people in your organization or people across the globe, whether from the civilian space or from a professional capacity, what they're talking about is data. What they're talking about is able to retrieve data, to be able to manipulate it, to be able to become smarter, to be able to become more creative, because ultimately, the ways that we've been doing any of our work for so long, I would have never thought 30 years ago when I was in college and getting through the process that I was going to be an expert at Excel. If somebody told me that you're going to go in and you're going to be in IT and you're going to move into security and hey, by the way, you're going to be an expert at Excel, I probably would have tried to continue my music career, regardless of what it paid. But the reality is we spend so much time doing these types of activities, and think about the strategic work that we're missing when we're tactically developing pros or going onto YouTube to identify how to do a pivot table, or how do we get data out of what we're seeing in any given capacity. Just think about the time wasted in that type of scenario. So what we are seeing today, there's two forms of this, right? And of course, you've got the public GPTs and the things that hopefully most of us have started to experience, because there's a lot of cool stuff, whether it's making images and doing some memes or whatever to make fun of your friends and get a laugh, or to synthesize information online that hopefully is to some level of accuracy, something that's going to get you to an answer faster. But you also have what I would go so far as to say has been around for a long time. Machine learning, the stuff that was limited to data scientists, That's some form of what I would consider your AI workloads, the things that are leveraging your Snowflakes and Azure and the Databricks and any of the systems that have a ton of data. There's been some form of what we call AI now. But then the other form of it is your generative AI products. And this is where the Microsoft Copilots, the Salesforce Einsteins, Google started with Bard and now they're calling it Gemini. There's going to be every iteration of this because, again, just like organizations that are going to use it or not use it, there's going to be the divide between them. But there's also going to be any of the tool sets and the data stores that are out there that are going to be the primary position of if they don't do something with AI, they're also going to be left in the dust. So consider this year is year zero. This is the worst version it's ever going to be. This is the least capacity and function that you're going to be able to have in any of these data stores with AI. And this is going to change dramatically, but this is an opportunity that we have as security and IT professionals to get in the game, to show the value, to show what you're thinking about from risk, to enable your business owners, your leaders, the people that have to own the risk for the organization because you understand data exfiltration, unauthorized data access, unauthorized data disclosure. They may not. That likelihood has changed. And I would go so far as to say I have had, regardless of my title has changed the last couple times, but the way I look at myself is former leader of GRC, I am a data advocate. I am extremely passionate about this because I've sat in the room for breaches. It's not fun. I still feel it in my bones. I still have nightmares about those times. I have lost sleep and not had the ability to sleep or go home for weeks, or if a third party gets breached. Or let's take it a step further. Change healthcare breach that took place. I have an autoimmune disease that I depend on medication every single day. And when I went to go get my medication refilled a month ago, guess what? You've got supplemental insurance. No, I don't. Well, we can't fill your prescription because we've got to work this out. That's their problem, not mine, but it became my problem. 2 weeks, I couldn't get my medication. This is a scenario right now that it's not just data breaches that are impacting a company and the boardroom and the P&L and everything else. It's impacting us. Every time I get a letter, my blood pressure rises because we can do better and we should do better. And this is our opportunity to do better because when it really comes down to it, Microsoft, for every single person in this room and every single leader across the organization that has an access to a budget, that has access to be able to staff appropriately, that has the ability to essentially own or mitigate risk, knows Microsoft. We all do. We've all used it. I certainly came up in the days when Lotus Notes was still an option. But for some people in this room, you probably don't even know what I'm talking about. And that's okay. Because everybody knows what Microsoft is. Because you use it, we know what we've got in our OneDrive. We know what we develop on Word. We know what we develop on Excel. And we also understand, for the most part, that pathway to access no longer has to go through an IT stage gate. You used to have to put in a ticket and say, okay, I need a manager approval, which I still think is like, meh. You get to a position where a data owner would approve it, fantastic. Now IT gets that ticket and they say, okay, what groups are they in? Do we have read and write or some level of practical least privilege? And we're going to put this person into exactly what they need, hopefully. And we have some semblance of what least privilege looks like. But with Microsoft and 365 and all the topics, and again, think about how this is relatable for everybody that uses it, is I get to share my data with everybody. This presentation I shared from my OneDrive to people outside of my organization. Now, all of a sudden, everybody in this room and the people that are from the help desk to the top of the heap have the ability to share data from their phones, from their Explorer, from the application directly, so many different ways. And think about how many people are thinking about what is the next thing I need to do because I've got a million projects and I just need to get this out the door. Let's share it with everybody because I don't know who's going to need it and I don't want to be bothered because I don't want a context switch. So while this is going to be a great productivity tool because we can start to do things in ways that are getting us out of that general tactical motion, we're going to be productive. But we also have to consider that 365 and Microsoft and the position that they have with OpenAI is they're not going to stop there. Think about all the areas that critical data exist in your organization. I'm fortunate enough to be able to talk to Microsoft on a routine basis. I think what they have in their hands and what we're all going to have in our hands is going to change how we operate on a day-to-day basis. But think about now how they're going to have plugins and all that data is going to come into Salesforce. Why are we just going to limit it to the tenant? If we're going to supply businesses with the ability to get more value out of their data, why don't we start connecting to everything? And we've got to figure out how that access model is going to work. And that access model, if you take a look at everything up on the screen, is different. It's very different. If people are collaborating, Salesforce has got their own way, and 18 different 1,000 ways that someone could get permission to data. It's going to continue to grow. So let's take a look at what this looks like in the most rightful scenario. We get into a scenario here. Hopefully, nope, maybe not. So what I was going to show you here in a forum that was supposed to give us the ability to show how this would work. You're on Teams, you're in a meeting minutes were going to be created, a task list was going to be created. You're able to focus on the meeting and not have to multitask and start typing and have your eyes going everywhere else and missing some portion of that meeting. But again, I think that we're going to run out of the ability for video here. Oh no, it works, yes. So here's a scenario. I'm going to let you watch this. I'm going to tell you how this came about. So there was a shipbuilding manufacturer that we were on site with out in Seattle. And we sat down with their IT team, and their IT team said, yeah, we turned on Copilot, we put it out to about 20 people, and we saw something that we immediately had to turn it off because we understand that our access controls are out of control. Ultimately, one of the IT folks was just like, I need to see what credentials are out there. We know Excel is the new Post-it note. We've got config files. We've got anything that can be read in a text level type of document. And guess what? You can't search a Copilot for passwords, but you can ask for credentials. Big difference. You can also do API tokens and all these other things. And you can convert it in a way that's going to be readable and make sense to you as a user. And in this scenario, fortunately, the IT person said, oh, this is a problem. Look what I found. But think about all the people, if you're in a pilot with Copilot, that are going to see this information, and they're going to tuck it away in the secret squirrel network, and on their way they go. Now think about if this person got compromised. Think about the insider that got this information. Now all of a sudden we have a problem. So really, the way that this all works essentially is that you go in, you put in a prompt, Microsoft is going to say, hey, we got your context and your corpus of data, everything that we're connected into, and we're going to use your permissions to get the information that you ask for. How many people in this room are comfortable with the permissions and the way that they are applied in some least privileged way in your own organization? This is where I think the benefit of productivity and the gains that we're going to get start to meet some friction with risk. Because I can tell you from the program that I built from the ground up and all the things that I put into place, I'm very happy I'm up on stage and having the role I have today versus the head of GRC, because this would scare the absolute you-know-what out of me. So it really comes down to Microsoft's doing exactly what it should do. It's not there to govern. It doesn't know what you're authorized to see. It doesn't. As long as you've got access to it, you've got access to it. Let's go. We got to move. And what they're going to do is take that prompt, make sure that you're not asking for social security numbers, but you can ask for sensitive data, or you can just ask for some employee information of social security numbers there. It's there. Or you can ask for credentials, but you can't ask for passwords. And it's going to make sure that whatever it's putting out to you is not going to be racist. It's not going to have bad language. It's not going to have some bias. And out the door it goes. So what most people do, let's go to Google, or maybe now ChatGPT. Let's find out exactly what we should do as an organization to make sure that AI is going to be used in a safe and responsible way, that we're combating the risk that we're not stepping into. And Microsoft points out what I would say is to be the understatement of the century. For many organizations, content oversharing and data governance can be a challenge. Yeah, certainly. It employs a lot of people. This is the scenario that we're up against and how we're going to combat that. And they double down on it because they have a cloud permissions report that they offer every year, I want to say for the last 5 or 6 years. And there's a bunch of stuff on here. I'm not going to cover everything, but there's one thing that tells me everything I need to know. 1% of the permissions that are granted are used. 99% are unused. They did this across 500 tenants. And I'm not up here saying anything bad about Microsoft. I think it's a great tool. I use it. I depend on it. But this is the scenario that we're up against, and what basically Copilot is going to take and dump fire all over, or gas on the fire rather, and that fire is going to get bigger. In any event, this is what we need to do, because the challenges that exist have always existed. The only thing that has changed now is the likelihood of these risks have risen to a level of immediacy. This is right now. People have too much access to data. If you're using labeling and you're trying to use labels for DLP, you got to make sure it's accurate. You got to make sure that you can't let insiders, we see them in the news all the time, just exfiltrate data and get access to data that they shouldn't have access to, and next thing you've got other problems. And you've got to be able to right-size that access in some way, but do it in a way that if everybody worked in a company, and it was all of us that worked in a company today, and we had the similar amount of data for whatever, we've got about 100, 125 people in here, we would all have to stop what we're doing for the next 6 months and only focus on access controls. That isn't reasonable, not from trying to meet the top line and bottom line objectives for an organization. Generative AI, there was a stat that I heard in a lot of the speaking engagements that I do that said 90% of the world's data has been created in the last 2 years. And I was like, oh, really? So I did some research on that, and I was like, oh my God, it's real. Since 2012, every 2 years, there's going to be 90% of the world's data that's been created. Generative AI is going to take that, and basically there's some suggestion that that stat will be true for 2 months. Because we're going to start using data in ways that we never knew that we could. So if we want a fighter's chance to be able to combat this, is we essentially need to get real-time visibility. What's important, what's sensitive, what's regulated, what is our intellectual property? We need to identify where it is, not through survey, not through something that's going to be aged as soon as we get out of that house. We need to be able to understand who and what has access to it. We also need to understand how it's being utilized, because if we want to take access away, if only 1% of data is being used, that the access exists, if that 99% of that access went away, would anybody know? Not if we know how they're using it and the time frame and the risk threshold, the tolerance that you have, that you would take an acceptable position to automate least privilege, to automate labeling based on your visibility, to make sure that all of that activity that you're generating isn't just an event log in a SIM. The science project of trying to get into an answer in a lot of cases without analytics is impossible, and it takes too long, and at the end of the day, you've spun up a bunch of time for somebody that's running on a treadmill and they get off and they're still in the exact same spot. You need to be able to make sense of what that information is, because then you can identify what's normal from abnormal. Now you can respond to what's abnormal. So when you get into that type of scenario, is the things that you need to do is essentially get the scan in, identify the data you have, make sure that the labels are in place. Let's get DLP, because if we've got access controls in the right sized path, and we also have labels that are correct from a DLP position, we've got the detective and corrective and preventive controls that are in place that are going to protect our data. You need to get to a position where you're not walking into a leader's office or a data owner and saying, hey, these 2,000 people can access this data. Can you do an access review? Get out of my office. That's what I would say if somebody told me to look over a 2,000 person spreadsheet and say, tell me who should and shouldn't have access. But if you eliminate everybody that doesn't have access or isn't utilizing their access, on average, that's about 20 to 25 people. Hey, data owner, can we sit down? I'm your security leader here, or your security practitioner. Let's have a conversation about an access review and entitlement review. Oh, 25 people, let's sit down. Come here, you want some coffee? This is where you need to be, because now you're in a position that you're part of the strategy. You're not part of the problem. Oh, excuse me, can I go back? Yes. And you get into the scenario where once you have DLP in place, you're monitoring the activity, because what's normal today may not be normal tomorrow with Copilot. You need to be able to separate those two things, or any generative AI. Copilot is what I use because it's relatable again, but it's how we're going to automate and continue to automate the policies and the process to get us to a position that we're securing our data. I've got about a minute and a half left, so I'm going to fast forward a couple of these things. If you do this right, think about that same prompt. If we get rid of the data, if we get rid of the data that we don't need, maybe that's too old. If we get rid of and we identify maybe through a label that we could say, hey, Copilot, don't use this data. There's no reason to have this password file or this set of credentials or this most important stuff that we've got from a PII perspective into Copilot. It doesn't have value to be searchable in this way. Get it out. Now you're in a scenario where we got access right size, we got DLP working, we're monitoring how it's being used so we can identify if somebody's searching for it. But guess what? Now we're in a position where, hey, if you want to start using this in the right way, you want to get more productive, you don't have to worry about that self-inflicted risk that you have without the ability to do any of this. This is where I'm at. I do want to say, from a Varonis perspective, I've worked here. I was a client from working in two different very large organizations, and information security came from the IT space. Data is very important. It affects more than businesses. It affects us all in this room. And it's upon us right now for this paradigm shift to grab the bull by the horns and become more important in your organization, because you are going to show them how they're going to meet their business objectives. Thank you so much.